International news now.
So let's move on to taking a look at this speech at the United Nations General Assembly. And, you know, the United Nations General Assembly is not just one day, right? It's a long meeting that has a lot of diplomacy rolled up in this meeting because so many world leaders come to New York City, and it's a real opportunity. And so I do want to start, rather than with the speech itself, with what your slide says is day one. And there's two things to note about the activities before Trump's big speech. One is that he had another speech in another meeting in which he was on pretty much safer ground with the world community, at least, in calling for reform of the United Nations bureaucracy. And in calling for reform in the United Nations bureaucracy, you have a pretty common problem that a lot of people acknowledge, which is that the UN bureaucracy is bloated, it's not very efficient, it costs way too much, there's way too much overhead, et cetera, and there's got to be ways to shift all of those resources to more direct problem-solving ventures than to keep this bloated bureaucracy going. And so he delivered that message. He did so in a way that was pretty well received, I would argue, from the other leaders at the UN. But it was also a good message for his base, which constantly looks for efficiency gains, and also it is in line with his general message of shifting some of the burden sharing away from the United States. He mentioned this in his speech as well, his speech from this morning, to the broader global community, that the United States is paying too much for this bloated bureaucracy. And so he tied those two together. How? By saying we the United States, pays 22% of the UN budget, something like that, and it would be fine, he says in one of his speeches, if the UN was more effective. But it's not very effective, and so we need...
being more effective fulfilled the goal of world peace.
Right. And so it's not getting the job done, and it costs too much money, and we're spending too much money, too much of the general budget. Now, the other thing that has gotten some attention is the lack of a footprint of the State Department and the United States in general at this UN meeting. And a lot of people trace this back, I've heard numerous stories here, to Rex Tillerson. And they say, Rex Tillerson, Elliot Cohen and NPR said he's going to go down in history as the worst Secretary of State in history, partly because he's just so hands-off and so minimalist in the way he's treating his own department. And he's sort of disengaging the United States by action rather than words, by not bringing very many people to big meetings like this in New York, saying, oh, they can, do their work from Washington, D.C. and the like. And this could potentially be a big problem, don't you think?
And the counter to these claims as well is that Tillerson all along has struggled to get his people into important staff positions in the State Department. The scuttle is that there has been a veto operating within the White House that has not allowed. There was a prominent movement during the Republican campaign among Republican foreign policy intellectuals. They signed off on a petition called Never Trumpers, saying we will never work for the Trump administration. Tillerson wants to bring some of the members of this group into the State Department, and the White House doesn't want him to. And so there's been conflict over how to staff these positions at the State Department, senior staff positions that rotate with each new presidency. And as a consequence, the State Department has remained understaffed because they haven't been able to settle this difference between the White House and Tillerson. And so one of the reasons that he's got a light footprint and that other countries are having a hard time contacting their co-principals at the State Department is the offices just aren't staffed.
Right. Yeah, and this this was a problem that was sort of forecast when Trump won election. That the whole bureaucracy and staffing the bureaucracy for this particular president was going to be a problem, and now it seems to have taken root. It's in particular in the State Department, but he is also getting criticized for not defending the budget of the State Department. He's kind of willingly going along with all of these budget cuts, and what's happening, which is not very common in U.S. history, is that the Congress is going back and replacing funds and insisting on the State Department doing some of the things that the president doesn't seem to want to do, nor does the Secretary of State seem to want to do in terms of foreign aid and diplomacy and the like. And so those are the two sort of background things. But let's get to the speech now.
And which clip are we going to show first?
We're going to show this clip that I call the principled realism clip, which talks about sovereignty and promoting American values. And in this clip, you'll see a good example of President Trump kind of trying to wed two popular themes that have emerged out of his presidency. And that is this idea that the United States isn't going to impose things on other states. It's going to protect, acknowledge, safeguard state sovereignty because it wants to safeguard its own state sovereignty. But it also wants to and will continue to try to lead the world and promote American values at the same time in a community of nation states that are all trying to protect their own sovereignty but come together when they're facing common threats. And so let's roll that clip now.
As President of the United States, I will always put America first. Just like you, as the leaders of your countries, will always and should always put your countries first. All responsible leaders have an obligation to serve their own citizens, and the nation-state remains the best vehicle for elevating the human condition. But making a better life for our people also requires us to work together in close harmony and unity to create a more safe and peaceful future for all people. The United States will forever be a great friend to the world, and especially to its allies. But we can no longer be taken advantage of or enter into a one-sided deal where the United States gets nothing in return.
So let's talk a couple of things that this clip evokes. And the first thing is, what does this tell us about his grand strategy? We've had this conversation. What is this principled realism? And what I hear in this clip is something that we've talked before. These are kind of the principles of offshore balancing and selective engagement. There's support for allies, but there's a strong defense of state sovereignty, which implies that the United States should be respecting the sovereign rights of other countries. There's an embrace of the state. And one of the things that I'm going to talk about in a second, state and state sovereignties, what's part of that is a critique of a reliance on international organizations. So he's going to criticize, and we just mentioned this in terms of the bloated UN bureaucracy. The UN hasn't been achieving the goals it was designed to do. There's a critique of international organizations more generally, and praise for the virtues of the state. These are kind of consistent with traditional realist principles that we've talked about in the context of selective engagement and offshore balancing. Let's talk now a little bit more about this embrace of sovereignty, and why would he do this, and why is this so important, and how is this a difference from prior administrations? And I think there's at least 5 reasons, some of which he mentions in the speech and some of which he doesn't, about why this focus on sovereignty is unique, who's he talking to, and its significance. And the first thing is, he's really making a claim that the principle or the best means of political organization in the international system should be the state. The state has long been an effective device to achieve political democracy, to achieve economic growth, and so we should continue to protect states more generally. Part of that, like I said earlier, this is a critique of international organizations and a reliance on international organizations. Why? Because then you're delegating authority from the state to a people's rightful rulers, in the case of the United States, that they elect. And then when you endow an international organization like the UN or the World Trade Organization to make policy, it becomes very hard for, he'll talk about unelected bureaucrats are managing foreign policy for the United States. That, in a sense, is eroding democracy within the United States and giving it to, say, faceless bureaucrats. And so there's a critique, an implicit critique of international organizations here, embracing the state. Why else is he embracing the state? One of the principal challenges to the state today is terrorism. And so, right, terrorism, by undermining or raising doubts about the capacity of a political leadership to provide security for its people, erodes the legitimacy of the state. And so, in this sense, by defending the state, he's also implying what is the principal threat faced by states in the world today? It's terrorism. So this focus on sovereignty is consistent with the focus of his foreign policy that wants to root out terrorism. Also part of this focus on the state and American ideals and making America great again, there is an appeal here to nationalist, patriotic sentiments that's consistent with the brand of foreign policy and conservatism that emerges from Bannon, from the Bannon wing of the Republican Party, and that Trump relied on to secure election last year. And so there's these consistent themes, right? He's carving out a new coalition in the United States by relying much more heavily on these appeals to nationalism, patriotism. And so how should we organize those views? What's the best way for the United States to realize its interests? It's to protect the rights of the state, to strengthen the state. We talked about the critique of international organizations. Interestingly, I think there's also a signal to China in here. This was much more prominent in the 1990s, but the United States, when the United States embraced democracy promotion, and in particular criticized China for human rights abuses, the response from the Chinese government has always, we are a sovereign nation. One of the obligations or one of the rules associated with sovereignty in the international system is the principle of non-interference in the domestic affairs of other states. And so what Trump is doing in this speech, by embracing sovereignty, he's saying, you need to respect our sovereign rights, but we will also respect your sovereign rights. This is consistent with the long-held foreign policy position of China, and it moves away from a traditional American focus on democracy promotion, because when the United States promotes democracy, implicitly that suggests if you're an autocratic leader, you're not democratic, we want to promote democracy, which means we're going to support opposition movements that want to liberalize your domestic institutions.
Right, and that's not non-interference.
No.
And that's one of the chief critiques of democracy promotion, is that it defies state sovereignty.
Yeah. So while he's focused heavily on sovereignty in this speech, there's a whole host of reasons for this, right? Which is, this is nested to the arguments about terrorism. This is about appeals to nationalism. This is critiques of international organizations. This is signals to other authoritarian states like China that we're going to do things differently than we have in the past. And this is implicitly a break from democracy promotion in American foreign policy.
It also is aligned with his economic policies, because, and he explicitly mentions that in the later on in the speech, in the sense that he's always going to follow economic policies that are in the best interest of the American worker in the United States. And you know, what's interesting about this is that this is a pretty severe break philosophically, and that's what some of the commentators and some of the people who had some access to this speech said. This is going to be a deeply philosophical speech. And I think this is what they were talking about, was this principled realism. Every president, whether they try to shake things up or not, want to get a label. They need a brand to sell their foreign policy. And principled realism, I think, is this attempt by President Trump to brand his foreign policy in a way that is attractive, not just to his base, but to a wider audience that might not have been completely attracted to the nationalist themes that he was talking about, and an international one. He can find some other, I mean, one thing I noted when we were playing that clip was that this was one, when he talked about sovereignty, that was one of the few mild, granted, applause lines in the speech. And so this is an important part of his address to the international community, I think, is this idea of principled sovereignty.
Can I say one more thing on principled realism here? At its core, realist international relations theory suggests we can understand a lot of what goes around in the world on the basis of what's the distribution of national interests held among states and the distribution of power among them. So what is he saying here? He's saying, the United States has interests. I'm going to represent American foreign policy. American foreign policy will be guided by those interests. I expect other governments to have interests as well. Sometimes we're going to disagree, but we're going to cut deals on the basis of these interests. We're going to, in some sense, it's a transactional view of American diplomacy and American foreign policy. Sometimes we're going to disagree, but there's going to be lots of opportunities to cut deals. What's not said that's part of this is these interests might not be these transformational moral concerns that have long guided American foreign policy, such as democracy promotion and spending political capital on protecting human rights abroad. You know, one of the omissions from the speech, which I was looking for. I mean, I'm just going through the transcript. Maybe I missed it in the first couple of minutes. There's no mention of Myanmar and the Rohingya in here, which is, I mean, we are in the midst. This was going to be the other story. We're going to talk about this next week. We're in the midst of a significant ethnic cleansing in Myanmar. 600,000 refugees have been forced across the border into Bangladesh in the last 3 to 4 weeks. And we got crickets on this today.
Yeah, a humanitarian crisis of epic proportions. And yeah, we were going to talk about that, but we'll save that for next week. I mean, because it's not going away. It's not going to change. And so, okay, so let's move on to the next clip. And in the next two clips, actually, there's kind of a pairing here of this speech really can be kind of boiled down to a statement of philosophy about what his grand strategy can be labeled as principled realism, and then calling out, in particular, two states. One being North Korea and the other being Iran. And we're going to start with his statement on North Korea because it's going to have a lot of commentary and fallout. So let's run that now.
If this is not twisted enough, now North Korea's reckless pursuit of nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles threatens the entire world with unthinkable loss of human life. It is an outrage that some nations would not only trade with such a regime, but would arm, supply, and financially support a country that imperils the world with nuclear conflict. No nation on earth has an interest in seeing this band of criminals arm itself with nuclear weapons and missiles. The United States has great strength and patience. But if it is forced to defend itself or its allies, we will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea. Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself and for his regime. The United States is ready, willing, and able, but hopefully this will not be necessary. That's what the United Nations is all about. That's what the United Nations is for. Let's see how they do.
So there's a couple of interesting parts of this. Now, we started the clip on the nuclear element of it, but prior to where we cut in, there was a pretty long explanation of all the humanitarian violations that the North Korean regime inflicts on its own people, and the poverty and persecution that it rains on its own citizens. So he really animates a picture of North Korea as a sort of depraved regime, a regime that's run by lunatics and maniacs. He really tries to cast this as an evil regime, and then gets into the threat that such a regime would get nuclear weapons. And what's I find most important about this clip is this idea that how he casts it. You know, he uses his style of naming, you know, having nicknames, and calls him Rocket Man to kind of diminish the status of the leader of North Korea. But in really trying to label this regime as crazy and irrational, then he tries to cast it as being on a suicide mission in trying to attain nuclear weapons. And what I find to have some real consequence here is whether that's a misreading of North Korea. We talked about last week when North Korea was trying to attain nuclear weapons and its nuclear program, that most observers see North Korea not as some irrational regime that is somehow obsessed with obtaining nuclear weapons for some nefarious goal, but rather a regime that is convinced that its very survival will hinge on a successful nuclear weapons program. And so if instead President Trump and the Trump administration views North Korea very differently than in these rationalist terms, and sees that the United States will do what it needs to be done to prevent this sort of insane drive toward nuclear weapons, then you have a very different kind of approach than what most observers looking at this seem to suggest, that, you know, cutting off access to resources and heightening sanctions is going to have the kind of effects that will eventually bring this regime to its senses. Instead, you're going to have something that raises the rhetoric and increases potentially the chance for conflict here.
I want to parse the words of the speech a little bit more on what you guys saw, and talk and make sure that we're clear on the implications and what this is actually saying. And so the end of that clip, and I'm reading through the transcript now, and my sense is the first 2/3 of that final portion of that clip was written by the speechwriters. I'm sure everyone went around and debated the specific wording, and I want to talk some about the implications. And then he ad-libbed a bit at the end, but I want to go through this because it's important. So the first where I'm going to start is, no nation on earth has an interest in seeing this band of criminals arm itself with nuclear weapons and missiles. So there is this appeal to interests that's consistent with the rest of the speech. Nobody has an interest in this. We are all, if we collectively work together to denuclearize the peninsula, it's in the interest of everyone to do this. This is consistent with the grand strategy I'm laying out. But then he says, the United States has great strength and patience, but if it is forced to defend itself with its allies, that clause is important there. Forced to defend itself or its allies. The implication being that the United States will respond in defensive terms, is not going to initiate military conflict. I would suggest that this clause was intentionally put in there to signal to the broader international audience that the United States isn't going to initiate the use of military force here. But then what's important is follows, but if the U.S. is forced to defend itself or its allies, right, extends out the nuclear umbrella, not just talking about if a missile was supposed to hit the United States, if it hits South Korea or Japan, then we will respond defensively. But then it's important what he says, how the United States will respond. We will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea. Those words were inserted in there intentionally, and he is saying that the United States will escalate and go nuclear here, right? The implication, totally destroy North Korea, you do that with nuclear weapons. And so the implication here is that if they embark on a strike, conventional or nuclear, we will respond with nuclear weapons and we will destroy North Korea. That's pretty significant, right? Because what are we talking about here? We're talking about the deaths of millions of people if that were to happen. Right. And the other thing to keep in mind here is, I would be skeptical in a hypothetical if the rest of the world would simply observe this. No. And not do anything about it. Right. So this is, I mean, that rhetoric was inserted intentionally. There are a couple of signals that are embedded there, the defensive one, but also the threat to escalate and go nuclear. those were intentionally written, and I'm sure that those were debated, and they're significant.
Where does that leave us with the lower grade goal? So if the United States isn't going to engage in preemption, right? That's the signal you're saying, and will react if North Korea launches any sort of conventional or nuclear attack. I mean, that's pretty much the conventional policy now. But what about continued pursuit of nuclear weapons? I mean, he's very clear and has been clear for a long time that we're not going to stand and watch North Korea build a nuclear arsenal.
Yeah.
And so,
And the challenge is, though, we are.
yes, well, in practice we are, right.
And so let's...
So rhetorically, there's a mismatch.
Yeah,
right?
and yes, there's a huge mismatch. The other thing to keep in mind, and when we talk about nuclear weapons more in about 5 modules, what we're going to see is the challenges that the U.S. faces right now in making these, because at the end of the day, what does the administration hopes? It hopes that by talking tough, there's a stand down on the part of North Korea, and there's room for a deal.
Right.
The challenges are the threats that were just implicitly made, that we just talked about, are they credible? And the United States learns in 1953 and 1954, under the Eisenhower administration, when the United States starts talking about escalating all Soviet incursions into Western Europe with nuclear weapons, that those weren't very credible threats. Right. And once the Soviets had their own set of nuclear weapons, it became much more difficult to extract concessions because they weren't credible anymore, because now the Soviet Union could strike American cities if the Soviets invaded West Berlin and the U.S. responded by attacking Moscow. This is the same dilemma that the United States faces today with respect to North Korea, which is why he wants to have nuclear weapons, which also suggests that the United States is going to have to adjust in the same way relative to North Korea, in the same way that the U.S. did relative to the Soviet Union in the 50s.
Right, and so there's a lot more that will develop here, and what's also in question then is how everyone else adjusts, right? I mean, so Japan is starting to have a debate about their military and the strength of their military, because if and when North Korea's military gets a full-fledged nuclear arsenal, how can Japan and South Korea not have one as well? And so there's a lot of implications for nuclear proliferation in general here from these developments.
We should run the last clip on North Korea?
Right, on Iran.
Sorry, Iran.
Right.
It is far past time for the nations of the world to confront another reckless regime, one that speaks openly of mass murder, vowing death to America, destruction to Israel, and ruin for many leaders and nations in this room. The Iranian government masks a corrupt dictatorship behind the false guise of a democracy. It has turned a wealthy country with a rich history and culture into an economically depleted rogue state whose chief exports are violence, bloodshed, and chaos. The longest suffering victims of Iran's leaders are, in fact, its own people. Rather than use its resources to improve Iranian lives, its oil profits go to fund Hezbollah and other terrorists that kill innocent Muslims and attack their peaceful Arab and Israeli neighbors. This wealth, which rightly belongs to Iran's people, also goes to shore up Bashar al-Assad's dictatorship, fuel Yemen's civil war, and undermine peace throughout the entire Middle East. We cannot let a murderous regime continue these destabilizing activities while building dangerous missiles, and we cannot abide by an agreement if it provides cover for the eventual construction of a nuclear program. The Iran deal was one of the worst and most one-sided transactions the United States has ever entered into. Frankly, that deal is an embarrassment to the United States, and I don't think you've heard the last of it, believe me.
All right. So let me just make 2 points about this, and then we'll have our quiz and call it a day. First, the critique of Iran and part of the Trump administration's critique of the Iran deal is that it does not cover all the other bad things that the Iranian regime does in terms of supporting Hezbollah and terrorist organizations around the world, support for the Assad regime, the destabilizing force that the Iranian regime is in. And this was a common Republican critique of the Iran deal when it was being negotiated, is that even if it does control the development of the nuclear program in Iran, that by lifting sanctions and enriching the regime in Iran, you will help subsidize a regime that is acting contrary to American and Western interests all around the world, and interests of a key American ally in Israel. That just on that basis, the Iran deal and the sort of greater integration of Iran into the community of states is not the appropriate approach to this regime. And so he purposely is trying to tie Iran with North Korea to make those two regimes the same or alike in the eyes of the world, so that there will be a broad coalition of states that is going to be willing to confront Iran the way it is trying to confront North Korea. I think that's going to be a much tougher lift because not everyone agrees with the United States and Israel about the nature of the Iranian regime. And he goes on, he spends a lot of time trying to differentiate the Iranian regime from the Iranian people, and that's done on purpose in order to showcase how it's the leadership and this regime that is taking all these actions. And then what he adds to that, a critique of the Iranian deal, saying that then there's also problems with the deal that will not necessarily prevent Iran from cheating, but also, more importantly, has a sunset clause that will not keep Iranian nuclear program offline forever. And so he then has this veiled threat, right, that, well, we might just walk away from this this deal. And that's, I think, going to be a huge problem for the Trump administration with its allies in Europe and also with China and Russia on this, because they don't agree. Everyone else wants to stay in this deal, and for good reason, right? You have one chief threat to nuclear proliferation in North Korea right now that the international community does not have a solution for. You've got a regime that's driving for a nuclear weapon, that all the actions that the international community can kind of come up with because of its constraints doesn't seem to even slow down that regime from missile tests, nuclear tests, and developing a nuclear program. You don't need to. And what the best, the conventional argument here in favor of the Iran deal is this is not time to have another potential nuclear proliferation issue for the world to deal with. Because if you end the nuclear deal that's currently in place for Iran, they could make a race for a nuclear weapon that very few countries would be able to stop.
So one final thing I wanted to point out about the speech, and kind of what's going on beyond the text, and who's it geared toward. This speech is also aimed at a domestic audience inside the United States, and it's still fighting the election of 2016 in at least 3 places. So we see this in the Iran deal. It's the worst deal ever. a clear criticism of the Obama administration for signing off on this deal. We're not going to forget the middle classes with respect to trade deals anymore. Again, a clear criticism of both prior Republican and Democratic administrations, their policy on trade. And then there's also in the portion of the speech on Afghanistan, he talks about his decision to increase American troop numbers in Afghanistan, and he says that the decisions about withdrawal are not going to be based on political timetables, which is another critique of the Obama administration. Instead, those will be set on the basis of strategic necessity determined on the ground by the generals. So we have this nested within this speech, again, it's criticism of how prior administrations ran foreign policy, but that also has an important international implication as well, because he's opening up the possibility that he's going to renegotiate everything. Or I shouldn't say everything, but he is going to feel free potentially to renegotiate some prior deals committed to by previous administrations.
Well, and one of the side stories that we didn't touch on is this whole Paris climate deal. They're still trying to talk Trump and the Trump administration into rejoining that, and that was a huge step taken by the United States to basically turn its back on a deal that the United States under President Obama was central to formulating. And so you still have this environment where people don't seem to quite know what to make of where the United States is going.
Heading to.
Yeah.